The anaerobic systems you can increase their capacity a little bit through taking stuff like creatine and also different ways that you train, right? But it's a very slight amount that you can improve them, right? Most of your ability to perform in an anaerobic fashion, to be an excellent sprinter or a jumper or wrestling, things like that, comes from genetics. Most of that is a genetic thing, having to do with the percentage of fast twitch fibers, how your body is set up and stuff like that, and the makeup of your muscle fibers, right? And that is genetically determined. But the one thing that anybody can improve and increase over time is your aerobic system. And so it makes sense to focus more on improving that so that you don't have to rely as much on your anaerobic systems, allowing you to then level the playing field a little bit more, because now you can spare that energy for the small window of time in the small amount that you have available, and also be regenerating it as you are working in that aerobic state. Hello, Aaron Kubitz, personal trainer, functional aesthetics EC, helping average guys perform better inside and outside the gym. Today's video I'm going to be talking about is probably going to be at least two-part series, maybe even more, covering the benefits of aerobic or endurance training for strength athletes. So traditionally, strength athletes would shy away from doing a lot of endurance type exercises, right? And especially aerobic exercise, thinking that the aerobic exercise would waste away all of their gains. Now, as some of you might know, I tend to favor the hybrid athlete style of training. So I have a program, actually 3 different programs within this training structure called Hybrid Strength, right? So I have my Hybrid Strength 101, which is kind of a 4-month program that helps athletes who are coming back into athletic training, or people who are completely new to fitness, strength training and stuff, kind of get themselves back up to speed by training in 4 different styles of strength training. Now, during the 70s and the 80s, that was kind of like the aerobics craze, right? Now, in the 70s, you had the average population, they weren't really exercising that much, right? And then you had, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the bodybuilders, and then there was a couple people, doing marathons and things like that. But, and then in the 80s, the aerobics thing really took off. And I remember my mom, even through the early 90s and stuff, every morning she'd get up and she'd do her Jane Fonda, and Denise Austin, aerobics workouts and everything. And there was a lot more people doing marathons and that kind of stuff, and that was, it was considered the healthy thing to do back in that time period, right? And on the other end of that, you had your bodybuilders, you had your powerlifters, and a lot of these guys didn't want to be doing a lot of aerobic exercise because, especially during the early part of the 2000s, I think even in the 70s, a lot of these powerlifters oftentimes were even pretty lean and had almost a more bodybuilder sort of look to many of them, except in the heavyweight categories, simply by virtue of the fact that they would actually train with a little bit higher volume and incorporate some bodybuilding style workouts into their routines in addition to their powerlifting stuff, which they do more when they're getting ready for preparing for competition. So back then there was less of a delineating line between powerlifting and bodybuilding, because both disciplines employed some of the techniques of either one. For case in point, you had Franco Columbo, who competed as a powerlifter and also as a bodybuilder. And so that was pretty common back in the day. Fast forward to the early part of the 2000s, and you had a lot of guys, especially on YouTube and things like that, online forums, talking about, well, you don't want to do too much running because you're going to waste away your muscles. You're not going to be able to build any muscle when you're doing that. And as you will see later on this video, the science doesn't really support that. In fact, if you do it right, and if you're eating the proper amount of calories, aerobic exercise and endurance training in general may actually enhance your capacities as a strength athlete, help you to build more muscle, provided you're still training as a strength athlete and you're getting enough calories in the organization and timing of how you do it. So one of the ways that aerobic exercise and endurance exercise in general can help you to increase your capacity for overall athletic performance and strength is through the increasing of the health of the mitochondria, as well as something called mitochondrial biogenesis, or increasing the number of mitochondria that you have. Now, you might remember from physiology classes and stuff like that, that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, right? So the mitochondria is responsible for creating something called adenosine triphosphate, also abbreviated as ATP, right? And creatine phosphate. And that is the energy that is used to power the body, not only exercise, but all the other functions within your body. So one of the things that tends to happen as we age is that we produce less mitochondria, right? And the health of our mitochondria decreases as well. There's less of the reproduction of the mitochondria, and also the overall function and efficiency of the mitochondria decreases. And this is why, if you continue to do aerobic training, it might help you to sustain more muscle as long as you're still strength training as well. Now, if you have more ATP in a muscle, right? So if there's less ATP being produced, there's less energy available for a muscle, right? Meaning there's less energy available for that muscle to exert, right? So when you're doing powerlifting, when you're doing bodybuilding, to a lesser extent bodybuilding, but if you're doing powerlifting, if you're doing, track and field where you're running the 100-meter dash, if you're doing the high jump, if you're doing Olympic lifting, those types of activities are activities that rely on your ATP/phosphocreatine system, and this system, if it's relied upon 100%, only lasts for about 10 to 12 seconds before it's depleted, and then it takes about 10 to 12 seconds per second of exertion to regenerate that system so that's ready to go again, right? And so because of the nature of this stuff, if you're using a ton of energy doing that, if your mitochondria aren't functioning at a very high level, if they are not able to regenerate the ATP and produce enough, your actual muscle strength is going to decrease as well, because you're going to not have phosphocreatine ATP stores in sufficient amounts to produce that high intensity level of exertion that you're looking for in a powerlifting competition, when you're doing track and field, etc. Another thing to consider is also the energy substrate use, right? So there are three primary different energy systems. You have the one that I was just talking about, which is your ATP/creatine phosphate system. You have your glycolytic system, and then you have your oxidative or aerobic system, right? For your endurance exercise, or what we consider cardio, right? When you're going out for a walk, if you're going for a jog, if you're going for a leisurely bike ride, anything that's, over a couple of minutes in length is highly aerobic in nature, right? And that's why if you're in the gym, if you're able to do more than 90 seconds of continuous work or something, that's why it's like if you're doing push-ups and you can do more than 90 seconds worth of push-ups, you're really training your aerobic system and your endurance capacity rather than strength. Now, somebody who can barely do a push-up, they're going to be working more of their high-intensity system, right? And so, given that that's the case, and that the ATP system regenerates really slowly, right? So it takes several minutes after just a couple seconds a few seconds of exertion to regenerate that and be able to go again at a high level of intensity. And then the glycolytic system only lasts a couple of minutes and then again takes a while to regenerate itself. That the more you can rely on your oxidative or aerobic system, which we know you can sustain energy production in that manner for hours and hours on end. Hence, the people who do ultra marathons, extreme long distance running races and stuff like that. And so we know that this can be produced for long periods of time. The problem is, and most of you might have already guessed, is that although energy can be produced for a very long period of time, the rate at which energy is produced is not fast enough to sustain massive outputs of energy at one time like the other two energy systems. So what do we want to do? Well, if you have the aerobic system is actually what helps to regenerate the creatine for the other two systems, right? So you're increasing levels of your phosphocreatine in ATP to be used in those systems, right? And so if you are able to have a highly conditioned aerobic system, that means that you will be able to train at higher levels of intensity for longer periods of time without actually having to rely on your high intensity energy systems. So another thing to consider is that aerobic exercise and also strength training both increase your insulin sensitivity, right? But aerobic exercise tends to increase it a little bit higher, right? And so when you're increasing your insulin sensitivity, this means that you have the ability to extract more energy out of a given amount of carbohydrates at any level of intensity, right? So rather than, and we know that carbohydrates are the main fuel for high intensity exercise, like those sprints and 1-rep maxes for deadlifts, squats, and bench presses, right? And that's the main fuel that is used for that. When you're exercising at maximal capacities, fat is going to play a bigger and bigger role in the energy production. So this is another reason why you want to rely primarily on complex carbohydrates and whole food sources of carbohydrates as opposed to sugars and refined grains and things like that. And the reason being that those things tend to elevate your insulin, make you less sensitive to insulin because it's much easier to obtain the sugar out of these things, right? You spike the insulin really high and and you always have that system going, right? And so the research has actually shown that the more you are eating sugars and refined grains and stuff like that, your body is always in this elevated insulin state all the time, meaning that you have less ability to tap into fat for energy. So not only does this pertain to people from an energy, from a body composition standpoint, right? Because if you're able to tap into fat for fuel at maximal intensities, it's going to mean that you will be able to have not only more energy and spare your muscle glycogen for those higher intensity outputs, but you're also going to have improvements in your levels of body fat percentage. So you'll be able to decrease body fat percentage using that fat for fuel at the lower intensity of exercise because the insulin is going to be at lower levels, and you're also going to be able to have keep in reserve that ATP and the glycogen and stuff for the higher exertion that you experience when you're doing sprints, super heavy deadlifts, and high jumping and Olympic lifting and all that kind of stuff. Or even if you're out on a really long hike, or let's say you're running a race, right? And the race is really long and you're getting towards the end, but now there's a big hill or there's a series of hills or something, right? If you are relying primarily on carbohydrates, you're going to be using them at a higher percentage during the race. Because as I said before, even if you are, and I didn't state this before, but let's say if you are running the 200 meters, right? Which is about 20 seconds of all-out maximal intensity. About 30% of the energy that is being produced for a 20-second event is being produced by your aerobic system or your oxidative system. So there's about 30% is coming from fat, right? And if you're going, let's say, doing the 400 meters, the 800 meters, and even the 1500 meters, right? After the first 15 to 30 seconds of those events, as much as 50% of the energy is also coming from the aerobic system. So all these different systems play a part in the amount that you're using. So there is, you're never really unless you are doing that 100-meter sprint or something. You're never purely just using your anaerobic systems, right? And so the idea is to increase the level of conditioning of the aerobic system, because the anaerobic systems you can increase their capacity a little bit through taking stuff like creatine and also different ways that you train, right? But it's a very slight amount that you can improve them, right? Most of your ability to perform in an anaerobic fashion, to be an excellent sprinter or a jumper or wrestling, things like that, comes from genetics. Most of that is a genetic thing, having to do with the percentage of fast twitch fibers, how your body is set up and stuff like that, and the makeup of your muscle fibers, right? And that is genetically determined. But the one thing that anybody can improve and increase over time is your aerobic system. And so it makes sense to focus more on improving that, so that you don't have to rely as much on your anaerobic systems, allowing you to then level the playing field a little bit more, because now you can spare that energy for the small window of time in the small amount that you have available, and also be regenerating it as you are working in that aerobic state. Okay, so some of the downsides of the aerobic exercise, and this is more so has to do with running, right? Because we know that, Tour de France cyclists, right? They have no problem having a lot of muscle in their quads, right? Even though they're doing hours and hours of aerobic exercise, right? Now their upper bodies are lacking a little bit, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but we can see that there's not the downside there. Now, the reason why running has been shown to be detrimental to your overall size and strength and stuff, if you are not lifting, let's say, and doing like squats and whatnot, is because of that repetitive eccentric component of running. Every time you're running, you're landing with several times your body weight, and you're absorbing it in an eccentric fashion, and so it tends to decrease the muscle mass that way. The other thing is that long distance running, 1+ hours of running, 90 minutes or more or whatever, tends to elevate and increase levels of cortisol in the body, right? Now, the thing that cortisol does is that it elevates levels of glucagon and stuff, and dumps more sugar into the bloodstream in preparation for fight or flight, right? And this, you would say, well, this is not a problem. I'm running, I want to have more energy, and I would say you're right. Now, the problem is that you're also depleting your levels of glycogen, right? And so as you're depleting those levels of glycogen, you have less carbohydrates to take from the muscles in the liver and put it into the working muscles, and so that glucagon or whatever is going to then convert muscle protein into the carbohydrates of the glucose to be used for the muscles while they're working. And again, this is another reason why you want to fuel with predominantly, complex carbs, whole food sources of carbohydrates. Reason being that you're going to become more adept at burning fat for fuel. Because if you can burn fat for fuel, that means that means that you're going to be relying less on the carbohydrates, right? Meaning that you will be sparing those carbohydrates, so that as you get deeper into the race and stuff and you start struggling more or whatever, you will be able to then tap into that if you're going up a big hill or something like that, and be less reliant on the carbohydrates to fuel the workout, so that you then don't start degrading your muscle protein as a source of carbohydrate fuel. All right, so getting back to the part about the Tour de France cyclist, right? So as you can see, most of them have very skinny upper bodies, right? And then they will have more mass in their lower legs. So it's been shown that cardiovascular exercise, aerobic exercise, is adequate for, sustaining leg muscle mass, provided you're not doing running or something, right? Running tends to, have an overall catabolic effect on the muscles. However, because of that increased aerobic exercise in general tends to increase capillary density, meaning you're going to get more nutrients and more blood flow. You're also getting, you have higher levels of mitochondria, so it helps to offset this a little bit, right? So they did studies on some masters athletes, so guys who were like, in their 70s and whatnot, and these guys were able to, with endurance exercise, maintain muscle mass in their legs, even increase the strength in their legs, just doing cycling aerobic exercise, right? However, because if they were not doing also resistance training for the upper body, they were losing that mass in their upper body because it was not getting stimulated, right? So you need to, if you're going to do, maybe you don't want to do squats or something, you just want to focus on biking. Well, biking will probably be pretty good for, you know, and you could get away with that maybe, just doing biking for your lower body, but then you'd also want to do some stuff for the upper body. And this is where I tend to think that combining body weight exercises or gymnastics, that kind of stuff, with cycling would maybe be a good plan for the guy who doesn't like lifting traditional weights or doesn't have a lot of equipment, because then he could exercise his lower body, gain that muscle mass in his legs from the cycling and stuff, right? And also increase that aerobic capacity, be overall fit, right? And then he could also increase the strength in his upper body as well, so making him more well balanced overall, because calisthenics or gymnastics training has been shown to be provided it's applied appropriately, has been shown to be pretty comparable to lifting free weights for building strength and muscle in the upper body. In fact, some gymnasts who are able to do like the planche exercise, right, where you're doing essentially a plank, but without your feet on the ground. So you're holding your whole lower body, your torso and your legs off the ground and supporting yourself with your arms. And because of the position of your arms, are basically your hands are back here, right? And then your shoulders are up here, and that puts a tremendous amount of strain and stress on the shoulder muscles. So these guys were shown that they often could bench press twice their body weight the first time they ever tried doing a bench press, simply because of the strength they had developed through body weight training. And body weight training, because you don't have more external load to add, you have to focus on some things called passive insufficiency and active insufficiency of a muscle, right? So active insufficiency of a muscle is where, let's say you're doing a biceps curl or something, right? And you're doing your curl, right? And at about the midpoint of the curl, you know, if I have my arm down like this, right? At about the midpoint, that's right about where your arm is at the strongest. It has the optimal level of mechanical advantage, right? When you come past that point, then you start to become actively insufficient, right? The muscle is shortened, has contracted so much that it is actively insufficient to produce more force, right? And so passive insufficiency has to do with when the muscle is completely lengthened out. And this would be a classic example of when you are doing like the planche exercise, right? Because the muscles, the shoulder joint, the biceps and everything like that are at their extreme range of motion. And so you're making them, they're very, very, they're put at a disadvantage, as it were, to produce force. And so when you do that, you don't need to use as much weight, and you can produce the same muscle building and strength building qualities that you can by adding more plates or more weight onto a barbell with using the same weight, but just decreasing your mechanical advantage. One more point of the mechanical advantage thing that I forgot to put in the last clip, and this is why when you're doing your chin-ups, when you're doing your push-ups, it's really important that you use a full range of motion. A lot of times people will be doing a chin-up, right? And they'll go up, they won't come all the way down, right? They'll come right about to here, and then they'll pull themselves back up, and right here, and pull themselves back up, right? Well, you're not actually, you're only strengthening it through a small range of motion, and you're not as strong as you think you are, because it's much harder at the end range of the joint to exert force than it is in that middle range. So maybe you can crank out more reps, but what's the point of cranking out more reps if you're only strong in that limited range of motion and you don't have the strength throughout the full excursion of that muscle? And the same thing goes for push-ups, right? If you're doing push-ups and you're only coming halfway down, you're not bringing your chest to the floor or something, you're only exercising in the strong range of motion of the muscle and completely leaving out the area that you're weak, and thus leaving a lot of strength gains on the table. Now, when it comes to strength, these 90-degree joint angles are where you're at your peak strength, right? So at this, in the biceps curl, right, in that 90-degree joint angle, that's where you have the most strength. Same thing in a squat. When you're parallel to the floor, that's where you have the most strength. But when it comes to building more muscle and size, increasing the range of motion, going to the full stretch of that muscle, that's what's going to actually allow you to build bigger muscles and stretch and stuff like that. And obviously there's a lot of other factors involved in how big the muscle can get. Genetics plays a huge part of that, as well as the amount of quality nutrition you're getting. Are you getting sufficient amount of calories? Are you allowing proper rest periods? Are you getting the sufficient amount of volume? There's a lot of different things that are involved in there. But one of the things that is going to help you increase muscle mass, take for example Tom Platz, right? Tom Platz was known for doing a lot of his work at extreme ranges of motion. He'd do stiff leg deadlifts, so he was extremely flexible. I mean, he could touch his head to his knees when he's sitting on the floor and stuff like that, even though he had these massive legs. He'd also do sissy squats, right, and hack squats, where you're basically doing a quadricep stretch and then lifting yourself back up out of that, and so maximizing your hypertrophy or muscle building effects. So another thing that we want to consider in terms of why you'd want to do aerobic conditioning training, and some of this I touched on kind of in a roundabout way previously in this video, is that it comes down to the cost of producing a particular type of energy, right? So the anaerobic systems, the cost to produce that energy is pretty high, right? You're going to burn through a lot of energy pretty quickly. Whereas with the aerobic system, it doesn't get produced quite as quickly, but it can be sustained almost indefinitely, right? For a very, very long time. You're only limited by pretty much your level of fitness. And actually out of all the animals on Earth, a human being has the greatest capacity for aerobic endurance, and a lot of that has to do with the way that we cool ourselves. So a lot of animals will overheat because they can't sweat like we can and stuff, but we have an extremely high capacity to be able to produce energy aerobically. And so the more you can rely on your aerobic system, the less you will have to tap into the anaerobic system, meaning that your training volume will be able to go up. And one of the key predictors of muscular hypertrophy is total training volume, right? So if you can train more at the same intensity, right? So if you have a highly conditioned aerobic system, this means that you're going to be able to oxidize fat better. So you're going to be using more fat at a lower percentage. So even with let's say a 5 rep max deadlift, as much as 30% of the energy produced to do just 5 repetitions of a heavy deadlift is from your aerobic system, right? So if your aerobic system is not conditioned enough, you might be gassing out prematurely in that and not be able to perform as many sets of deadlifts as you otherwise would. And that's why sometimes I like to undulate between doing more aerobic type training and higher volume weightlifting, and then coming back around and hitting those heavier lifts again. And what that does as well is it helps, because the higher volume training tends to wear you out a little bit more, right? Whereas the heavier training is more taxing on the central nervous system, the aerobic training or the high volume training is more taxing on your overall metabolic system, right? And so, transitioning back and forth between the two allows you to maintain a high overall level of fitness and to continue to progress as well, and you're not limited by the capacity of your aerobic system. So as I was talking about before, one of the key drivers of muscle protein synthesis, hypertrophy, bigger muscles, is total volume, right? Which is the total amount of reps times the total amount of sets times the total amount of load, or the amount of weight that is on the bar, right? So for example, I would always kind of be thinking to myself in the past when I had this manual labor job and I was walking 13 miles a day, right? And I was doing moderately heavy lifting the entire time for 8 hours straight, right? And then afterwards or before I'd go, depending on, if I didn't have any energy left at the end of the day, because I kind of depleted myself, because I also had dietary restrictions, and if you're not able to fuel yourself, sometimes your glycogen would be depleted. But anyway, that's beyond the scope of this video. So anyway, I would do, I calculated it out one time, and I would lift 24,000 pounds worth of weight in my chest and shoulders workout, right? And now my workouts are shorter, right? But I'm also lifting heavier weight for lower reps. And then when I calculated it out, even though I'm lifting more on my bench press, I'm squatting more, I'm deadlifting more than I was back then, the total amount of weight or the total volume of my workout is actually lower. And so you can actually be increasing your strength levels in the short run by lifting lower volume, higher intensity, right? But in the long run, you decrease your ability to build more muscle mass, right? And this is why sometimes you can have guys who are skinnier and they're lifting a lot of weight because it's more of training the nervous system to recruit the most amount of muscle fibers possible. With that being said, in general, a bigger muscle does give you more potential to lift more weight, right? So if your aerobic system is highly conditioned and it allows you to perform either the same, perform more reps with the same amount of weight, or perform the same amount of reps and feel less fatigued, it's going to allow you to have more of a total volume, right? So the total amount of weight that you're lifting in your sessions is going to increase, which will then translate over, hopefully, to having bigger muscles, right? And as I stated before, a bigger muscle in general has the potential to have more strength potential than a smaller muscle does, right? And so in the long term, it will allow you to be able to lift more weight because you have more muscle mass. Like they say in powerlifting communities, mass moves mass, right? If you have, and this is why linemen and stuff are bigger, right? Because if you have more mass, you're going to be able to move more load, right? And so even if you are pound for pound extremely strong, you know, generally having more mass is going to allow you to build, to move more weight. And as long as you're eating enough calories and you're not doing hours and hours per week of aerobic exercise or endurance type training, that endurance training is not going to have a negative effect on your muscle building or strength building goals, and in fact could actually enhance them. Okay, so another consideration as far as it goes for the advantages of the aerobic system in terms of strength is your ability to recover. Right? So in the past, they thought that the buildup of lactate or lactic acid within the muscles was caused by was what caused soreness in the muscles, what caused you to have the soreness in the days following. What they later found out is that lactate is actually cleared out of the muscles within an hour after exercise. And actually lactate is the preferred source of fuel for the heart during high intensity exercise, right? But there needs to be oxygen and aerobic enzymes present for lactate to be metabolized. And so one of the ways that you can tell that you are training anaerobically is when lactate begins to build up, right? Because that means that there's not sufficient oxygen or aerobic enzymes available to metabolize that lactate, and so it starts to build up in the system. So, as I talked about before, the aerobic system is what helps to restore ATP and creatine phosphate for the other energy systems, right? And so, if you can have a more efficient aerobic system, you will be able to recover more quickly in between sets of working out, as well as in between workouts, which, as I stated before, will allow you to train more frequently, thereby increasing your levels of strength and muscularity, right? Because one of the factors that is related to your ability to build more strength and size to a certain degree, for size, more so for strength, is the frequency at which you work out, right? So you don't want to be training, causing a lot of muscle damage every time you work out. So maybe you have one workout a week where you really go hard, you lift heavy weights and induce that mechanical damage and the breakdown of the muscle fibers. And then you have the other workouts where you're training the same muscle groups, but you're not training them to the same degree. Maybe you're going more of a bodybuilding style of training. Some days you're doing more calisthenics endurance style of training, right? And that's actually what I incorporated into my hybrid strength programs, right? I have kind of like these descending reps, right? So you will be having in the advanced hybrid strength program, you will be combining strength training, power training, bodybuilding training, endurance training, all in this undulating sort of fashion to optimize your recovery and be hitting all the different factors that are going to be involved in building muscle and building strength at the same time, while capitalizing on the fat oxidizing capacities of both the endurance exercise and the power training abilities. Because as has been shown in research that irregardless, we've heard the term that abs are made in the kitchen, right? And that your diet is the most important thing in terms of getting lean, right? But irregardless of a calorie deficit, power training has been shown to be able to help you lose body fat, particularly that visceral body fat that's packed in around your internal organs and stuff. And a lot of it has to do with the increase of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and as well as human growth hormone that is stimulated, and to a smaller degree testosterone, by doing power type movements. And that's kind of what I incorporate into my hybrid strength program. Now, the other programs more help you to prepare for this, because advanced hybrid strength is more for advanced athletes. It is very taxing and strenuous type of workout, but actually once you acclimate to it, it makes you feel awesome when you're done. You don't feel as exhausted as you do from doing a long run. You don't feel like kind of the joint beat down you do from just lifting heavy weights, and you feel more stimulated than you would if you just did bodybuilding style of training. So another interesting concept, and something that I just recently learned, is how the level of intensity of an exercise affects energy expenditure, right? So work or energy expenditure scales proportionally or directly with work, right? So if you're working twice as hard or at twice the level of intensity as you are with another exercise, you're going to expend or burn more calories doing that exercise. And that's why, when I was in high school, there was a couple girls at my church, right? And they were talking about how their friend, who was a marathon runner, he was talking about the fat burning zone, right? He's like, when you're training aerobically and stuff, you're training your body to become more efficient at burning fat, which is what I was talking about before, right? Yes, you are burning a higher percentage of fat for fuel when you're training at a lower intensity, like walking, jogging, leisurely cycling and stuff, at that point where you can essentially breathe just through your nose, right? And keep your mouth shut. You can carry on a conversation, maybe slightly breathless, but you can carry out complete sentences, right? You're going to be burning predominantly fat, higher percentage of fat, when you're doing those kinds of exercise. However, at the end of the day, a calorie deficit is what causes you to actually lose body fat, right? So just because you're burning a higher amount, a percentage of fat, doesn't mean that that's going to translate to loss of body fat off your body, right? Now, from athletic standpoint and stuff, and what I've been talking about here, and your ability to persist at a higher volume or moving more weight for more reps, for more sets, yes, it's going to be beneficial in that regard, but not necessarily from the standpoint of losing fat off your body. Now, and this is why actually performing higher intensity exercises, even though they're not burning as the same degree of fat for fuel, can burn more total overall calories, thus contributing to your fat loss goals more substantially than doing low intensity exercise, and you can do it in a shorter period of time. So for example, let me illustrate here. If you are doing a set of 4 sets of 8 reps with 400 pounds at a deadlift, right? You're going to burn twice as much as if you did the same with 200 pounds, 4 sets of 8 reps, right? And this is why sometimes newer lifters, right, can perform a set of 10 reps and not be nearly as fatigued as a more advanced lifter who's lifting a substantially more amount of weight, because that advanced lifter is expending way more energy doing that same 10 reps because he's moving more load, which burns more calories, right? And so he'll require more time to recover. And so this is where the aerobic conditioning component and that endurance training comes into play, right? Because if you can condition yourself so that you are relying less on these high intensity modes of metabolism, your ATP, your creatine, phosphate system, and the glycolysis system, right? Then you will have more energy, more calories, more creatine, more glycogen available for that maximal effort, right? So you do your warm-up and stuff, and you're saving all that stuff, and then when you get to that max, you haven't really depleted it too much, and so you have way more energy to put forward towards that. So the more your aerobic system is conditioned, the less you're going to have to be, the less you're going to be depleting yourself, and the more energy you're going to be able to put more force and into those higher intensity bouts of exertion, whether it be sprints, Olympic lifting, powerlifting, high jumping, whatever the case may be, even like parkour type stuff, which is probably a combination of both the ATP, glycolytic, all of those different systems, but probably definitely relies a lot on the glycolytic system to produce the energy for that. Okay, so to further drive home this point, that on the concept that work scales with the energy consumed scales with the amount of work, the intensity of the exercise being performed. So For example, and how this is going to, all come back to why you should incorporate aerobic and endurance type training into your regular strength training if you want to truly maximize the amount of weight that you can move, particularly if you want to have a high strength to weight ratio. Now, and the reason that I say that is that guys like Eddie Hall and Thor, who are, world-class strongmen and stuff like that, when you're at that big, at a certain point, you're going to have to gain some body fat. You're going to have to get a little bit bigger and stuff, and you're going to have to specialize to be the absolute strongest that you could be, right? But for anybody else who wants to also be healthy at the same time and lift the most amount of weight possible, you want to have total, full, well-rounded fitness. Okay, so to the example, there is a test for testing anaerobic capacity or your VO2 max, right? And it's called the Wingate cycling test. The Wingate cycling test is known to be one of the most intense, brutal fitness tests that scientists conduct to for various different reasons, but it's all to test somebody's aerobic capacity, right? And so what the test consists of is 3 all-out maximal bursts of cycling, 30 seconds, hard as you can go until the clock stops, right? And so what they have noticed with the Wingate cycling test is that in the first round of this, between 6 and 15 seconds, that the ATP-CP system is carrying most of the load, right? And then after that, the aerobic system is picking up most of the load. So even in the first round, half of that 30-second bout is being carried out by the aerobic system. And by the time you get to the third round, you basically have a blurb of about 6 seconds with the ATP-CP system or creatine phosphate system contributing to that, and then the rest of it is basically being done by the aerobic system. So why do we bring this up? Well, we bring this up that even in an extremely brutal test like the Wingate cycling test, right, which is supposed to be all anaerobic capacity because it's only for 30 seconds, right, that even in that test, there is a huge component that is aerobic. The aerobic energy system is contributing a lot to that process. So how this relates to weightlifting is that if you recall earlier in this video, it requires for every second that you are using your ATP creatine phosphate system, it will require 10 to 12 seconds to regenerate your fuel to use that system again, right? And so in MMA, right, which is basically predominantly your ATP system and then your aerobic system, but if you can condition yourself appropriately, you can have it so that you can actually string out the ATP system for much longer, so you're not using it 100%, but you're having a trade-off between the aerobic system and the ATP system, so that as the high power, because to do the knockout punches and those powerful kicks and stuff like that, as those ones are being depleted, you are turning over to the aerobic system, and then the aerobic system is also regenerating the ATP for that power system so that you are ready for the next all-out max, punching or kicking, right? And so if you can hit that conditioning right, it allows you to go longer and harder, okay? So some people might say, okay, well, this is all talking about a cycling test, though, and these are supposed to be the most brutal in the world. And I'm just a weightlifter, right? I'm lifting weights. I want to lift heavy things. I'm not trying to sprint for longer periods of time, right? Well, the reason that they use the Wingate test is because there's not enough people that can, squat 500 pounds for 10 reps, right? And as we saw before, the amount of weight or the intensity of the exercise and the energy expended scale proportionately, right? So if we go back to the example of the 4 sets of 8 deadlifts with 400 pounds, right? You are actually expending 25 to as much as 60% more energy doing that than the people in that Wingate cycling test were. So there is actually a lot of a crossover, a lot of application between that, what we have seen in the Wingate test, and how much the aerobic system contributed to that and what you see in powerlifting scenarios or sprint training type scenarios. You want to have general overall fitness, which will then help you to maximize your abilities in your strength and muscle building efforts. Another added benefit to improving your aerobic fitness and your endurance is that as you get further into your training, whether it's in the weight room or especially on the athletic field, if you're playing soccer, football, things like that, right? As fatigue begins to set in, you begin to lose motor control, just meaning that your coordination starts to decrease, right? And you also start to lose some of the shock absorption capabilities of your muscles. So like when you're running and everything, oftentimes people don't really consider how much the muscles actually play a role in decreasing the amount of, impact to the joints when you're running and things like that. And that's actually why running with a middle of the foot stride is actually healthier for your joints than running with a heel toe sort of impact, simply just because of how the ligaments and the muscles in the foot interact with the muscles and the ligaments and the tendons in the calves and then in the thighs and stuff and in the hips to absorb that shock and kind of act as not only to absorb the impact when you're hitting the ground, but also to spring you back up out of that. And you kind of lose a lot of that when you land on your heel. You're kind of like putting the brakes on and then rolling over the foot that way. And so that's why learning how to run with more of a midfoot stride can be beneficial. Now that's a little bit off the topic here, but it still plays a role here. So if you can improve your endurance, right, you're going to be not going to be exhausting those energy systems that we talked about earlier as quickly, and thereby you will retain your coordination and the ability of those muscles to absorb the shock at higher intensities of training for longer, and reducing the risk that you will get injured, tearing a muscle, or straining something because you lost that coordination and the shock absorption ability of the muscle to do so. Okay, so in summary, cardiovascular exercise can help enhance your strength and muscle building endeavors through the increased capillarization of your muscles. So that's going to deliver oxygen and nutrients more rapidly to your muscles, meaning that you're going to be able to recover more quickly in between sets and in between workouts. And it's also going to decrease your reliance on carbohydrates at submaximal intensities for producing energy, right? And so that's going to spare the carbohydrates and your ATP and your phosphocreatine for those really high intense efforts. The other thing is that cardiovascular exercise actually helps to emphasize or increase parasympathetic nervous system activity, or that more restful state, right? And to kind of downregulate sympathetic nervous system activity, right? Because when you are lifting super heavy weights and stuff, there's the one thing that he talked about, the toll that it takes on your central nervous system, right? And so if we can help to relax that, help you to get into a more restful state more quickly, you are going to be able to build more muscle, right? It's going to create a more optimal hormonal environment, higher testosterone, things like that, than if you're always just straining, pressing really, and pushing really hard all the time. If you can have pushing really hard, kind of like that Chinese philosophy, yin yang, right? So you have the push hard and then relax phase coming after that. And by coupling those two together, your pushing phases will over time become harder and harder, and you will be able to move more weight, build more muscle, and actually train at a higher level of intensity than if you are always just training at a high level. All right, guys, so wrapping it all up here, what is the practical application of all this information that I've given you, okay? So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the traditional or conventional wisdom on this, and then I'm going to give you a peek or an insight, a snapshot into my hybrid strength model of training that I found to be not only very beneficial for helping you develop full spectrum fitness, so both strength, muscle mass, and then also leanness and conditioning, along with some flexibility as well. But it also helps you to fit in a lot more work in a short period of time and help you get up to speed and recover faster in between sets, as I've been talking about earlier on in this video, how the aerobic stuff and how combining different things together can help you to recover faster so that you can perform at a higher intensity on subsequent sets and also train more frequently or do more workouts, right? So this is kind of what my hybrid strength program helps you to do, helps you to achieve a high level of fitness in a very short period of time, provided, and it also has 3 different programs. You have Hybrid Strength 101, you have Hybrid Strength 2.0, and then you have Hybrid Strength Advanced. And Hybrid Strength Advanced is the program that is actually true hybrid strength training. The other 2 programs are primarily to help you build from whether you're just a beginner in the weight room or you have been doing other styles of working out, and to help you kind of build your capacity in 4 different styles of strength training so that you can then blend them all together in the advanced hybrid strength training model. Okay, so to start off here, is it better to split up your cardio? And you might have already guessed this, but is it better to split up your cardio and your strength training sessions, or to do them both at the same time? Either doing the cardio first and then the strength training, or doing the strength training first and then the cardio. Now, from my point of view, it seems pretty obvious that you'd want to do your strength training first and maybe a light warm-up or something just to get the juices flowing, get more nutrients into the bloodstream and stuff. Dang it, my nose is itching. So get more nutrients flowing into the bloodstream, and then go do your cardiovascular exercise afterwards. Reason being, you're going to have more energy to do the more energy taxing things, at this point of the video, should be abundantly clear that strength training is going to, especially heavy lifting, is going to use up a lot more energy than doing some cardiovascular lower intensity type work, right? However, I did recently see a post on Facebook where the guy was pretty strong. He was bragging about how he'd done 45 minutes of intense athletic style of cardio and then went and did squats, sets of squats with 315 pounds. And I was like, man, you could have been doing 350, maybe even 400 pound squats, and then go do your cardio afterwards with whatever energy was left over, and it would give you a better training effect. And that's why I figured I need to address this. So, if your primary goal is to build muscle and strength, right, then what you'd want to do is perform a little bit of cardio or something, or some dynamic warm-ups using similar, actually this is even better, use similar movements to what you're going to be using in the weight room with just your body weight, and a little bit higher reps to kind of get your system warmed up, right? And then go do the strength training, and then do your cardiovascular exercise on a different day, or maybe a little bit on that day just to mop up whatever energy is left over, and then go do it on a different day, right? Now, the key is here that you can build muscle while you are also doing some cardiovascular exercise, provided you're getting enough protein and calories overall to make sure that you're not going into a deficit. Because one of the primary reasons people do cardiovascular exercise, and aside from the heart benefits or if they are an endurance athlete, and that's what they do for their sport, is to help them get into a calorie deficit. So you want to make sure that if your primary goal is to be building more muscle mass and strength, that you are not shooting yourself in the foot, as it were, by putting yourself in a calorie deficit, burning off too many calories with your aerobic work. So you got to make sure that is the case. Now, the other option is that you can do low intensity, super low intensity, right? So, walking or yoga, light spinning on a stationary cycle or something like that, to in between sets of heavier lifting, right? So for example, if you're doing a set of squats or something, and you're breathing pretty heavily after you get done, you could just walk around the gym for a bit, or pace back and forth, or hop on a rower or something at a light intensity, right? So you're not straining yourself to do it. You're not trying to get a workout. You're just trying to kind of moving the body while you're breathing to help accelerate your rate of recovery. And another thing that I found is beneficial is to do qigong exercises or yoga exercises where you're kind of stretching the body out in different ways and stuff as you're breathing, and it helps to actually accelerate your recovery time. Dr. Andrew Huberman actually talked about this on his podcast, and so something that I found was actually highly beneficial to me in college, and how this whole hybrid strength method came about has actually been proven by science recently, when Huberman was talking about that, saying that doing aerobic exercise in between anaerobic exercise helps to accelerate that recovery. And I actually talked about that early in this video too, because that aerobic exercise helps to regenerate ATP and phosphocreatine and get you back to a more, and also metabolize lactate, right? And get you more back to a state of homeostasis so you can go back and hit it hard again in that next set. Okay, so that last method that I just talked about, where you are, say, doing a set of deadlifts, and then maybe you're hopping on the spin bike, or you're doing a set of deadlifts, and then you're doing maybe some light kettlebell swings, or hopping on a stationary bike, whatever it is, right? Is actually ideal for if you're trying to maximize fat loss, right? And the reason being is that when you're doing intense exercise like heavy squatting and stuff like that, you're actually, in addition to burning through your ATP and creatine phosphate, it actually helps to ramp up these fat burning hormones as well, and you're releasing fat, particularly visceral fat around the internal organs, right? You're releasing fatty acids into the bloodstream, and then that cardiovascular exercise in between helps to metabolize that fat, use it for energy rather than it being redeposited back into your fat cells. And this is actually how you can actually maintain muscle mass, even increase it slightly, and mop up all that fat so that you can be both big and lean, which is the epitome of what the goal of a bodybuilder is, to achieve the biggest size, symmetry, and conditioning or level of leanness possible. And usually without the use of drugs, it's really hard to do that. And so that's why a lot of times a power lifter will look a little bit more soft and fluffy than a bodybuilder, but the bodybuilder, at least in a natural sense, oftentimes won't be as big as the bodybuilder because he's doing so much volume and stuff like that. So if you're doing a range of super heavy lifting, moderate heavy lifting, and then also doing some aerobic work to help accelerate that recovery, as long as the aerobic work is not fatiguing you too much because you're doing it too high of an intensity. So you want to be doing like zone 2 aerobic work that, if it weren't for the fact that you were breathing heavily from doing your heavy squats or deadlifts or bench presses or whatever, that you could carry on a conversation while you were doing it. Okay, so to wrap up this video, let's get into a little bit of a brief overview of the structure of a hybrid strength training workout, okay? So let's say, for example, you're doing some deadlifts, right? So you don't want to go straight to doing those heavy deadlifts right away, obviously, so you do what you normally do for a warm-up, right? So let's say you start off with doing whatever you can do for 10 reps, right? So hit 10 reps, add a 10 to 20% to the bar, then you're hitting maybe 8 reps, and then add a little bit more weight, hit 5 reps, and then maybe hit 3 to 1 reps in the next set, so you're basically quickly getting up to speed as fast as possible, right? Now in between these sets of lifting, then you'd be hopping on a spin bike or something like that, maybe even doing some light kettlebell swings, in the beginning, right? Or actually, the way you could do it with the kettlebell swings is to do, as the reps are higher at the beginning when you're doing the lighter deadlifts in the 10 rep range, then you would grab a heavier kettlebell and maybe just swing it 4 or 5 times or whatever. Not enough that you're really tiring yourself out, but you're also using the cardiovascular system a little bit, but you're also not adding more reps onto the 10 reps that you already did. So kind of that moderate mid-range weight, mid-range reps for the kettlebell swing, right? And like I said, the alternate could be hopping on some sort of cardiovascular equipment or just pacing around to help yourself recover faster, getting back to that next set of deadlifts, and getting up to that maximal weight or intensity as quickly as possible, okay? After you've done that, then you're going to do an actual set of power work, right? So then you'd be doing either kettlebell swing, barbell cleans, some sort of snatch movement if you have the proficiency in the Olympic lifts to do it. A one-arm dumbbell snatch is a good alternative that doesn't require quite as much technical proficiency, but still provides a lot of the same benefits. Reason you'd be doing these kinds of power exercises instead of doing like a jump squat or doing a sprint or doing a sled push is because these kinds of power exercises actually use these same muscle groups as the deadlift, right? So you're using the deadlift in a strength capacity, then you're using these movements to use those same muscles in a power capacity, then you use a little bit of endurance type work to help recover yourself, some light zone 2 type cardio, right? And then right after that, you're going into a bodybuilding style of training, right? So you're using the same muscle groups again, but this time for multi-joint movements. So maybe if you're doing a deadlift, you're doing either pull-ups, you're doing barbell rows, cable rows, something like that. And then you're following it up with some more isolation type work in the 10 to 15 repetition range, maybe as low as 8 repetitions, but in the beginning start out with a little bit higher repetitions, and as you progress in your training, maybe you can cycle in a periodized fashion, doing a little bit lower reps and heavier weight, right, for that isolation stuff, okay? So then you'd be doing like, you know, dumbbell curls, barbell curls, preacher curls, whatever, to kind of finish off those biceps. And then to finish off the whole workout and help yourself recover as fast as possible, I like to do some qigong, deep breathing type exercises, relaxing type stuff, maybe even some yoga, stretching type movements where you're incorporating stretching, but along with the breath, and it's a more dynamic stretch rather than just a static stretch, especially after you've been breathing a little bit more, a little bit harder. So just like in the beginning of the workout, you're gradually ramping yourself up to that crescendo and then kind of gradually stepping down in intensity, and the same thing with your stretching. Started a little bit more dynamic stretching and then finishing off with static stretching, and maybe even just lay on the floor when you're done and relax. All right, guys, that concludes the video. I know I covered a lot of information, a lot of technical science type stuff in this video. Feel free to go back, review the information. I will be making some more videos in the future, kind of breaking down individual components of what I talked about in this video, but I did want to kind of do a broad overview of this as I get more into hybrid athlete training, particularly my hybrid strength model. So the traditional model of hybrid athlete is where you're basically combining, say, like a powerlifting or bodybuilding style of working out with endurance work. My style of hybrid athlete actually incorporates power work as well into there, as well as some like gymnastics type exercises as well. So a little bit different than the traditional hybrid athlete model, and that's what I'll be covering a little bit more in subsequent videos. So stay tuned for that. Some of the topics to be covered is going to be the importance of power training, right, for improving obviously athletic performance, as well as burning fat. So we've all heard the term that abs are built in the kitchen, right? That you need to rely on your diet to get you lean, while the exercise helps to improve your performance and stuff like that, right? Now, diet does play a role in optimal performance as well, but it's especially crucial when comes time to lose that body fat and gain some muscle definition. Now, what we've seen though is that power training is the one exception to this, that irregardless of your diet, with power training, you can actually see some improvements in body composition, and we see this when we're looking at, track and field athletes, especially 100-meter sprinters, things like that. They definitely have muscular, lean physiques. Obviously, they're doing work in the weight room, and they usually don't eat complete junk all the time either. So you do want to have a relatively nice diet so that there's the right macronutrients and micronutrients available for your body to adapt. But as far as calories go, sometimes you can get away with a little bit extra calories and stuff like that, and not be super strict with what you're eating if you are incorporating some power exercises into your plan. I am then going to go over why why everybody should do some bodybuilding in their training. Then I'm also going to be going over the benefits of body weight exercises as opposed to free weight exercises, and also how to blend both of them together, and also, how to bring up your legs if you don't have a lot of equipment and access to free weight exercises, because we know that calisthenics exercises are not ideal for leg training, but they can provide pretty comparable levels of strength and muscle mass for upper body. All right, guys, if you liked the video, hit that like button. If you'd like to see more content related to workout design, hybrid athlete training, nutrition for both performance, muscle building, and fat loss, as well as how to train around injuries if you sustain them in the course of your training career, and also how to set up your training to avoid the injuries from happening in the first place, consider subscribing to the channel by hitting the button in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And we'll see you all next time for more health and fitness information.